Welcome to UFOlogy Explained. This is Steve Snodgrass, president of the Omaha UFO Study Group, and this is exciting for me. I just found out this is my 10th anniversary of taking these UFO ET talks from our annual UFO Symposium at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and converting them to YouTube presentations. Now, I know not many of you have watched these talks, but hey, I upload them for free. You can watch them for free, and this is a moment for me nonetheless. So in Integral UFOlogy Parts 1 and 2, the UFO ET hypothesis, those were the first three that I made. And since then, I've used the word ufology in all but one of these talks. Remember, end of ufology, truth about ufology, alien ontology, spirit of ufology, super ufology, and striking ufology. Well, this one has a daring title, UFOlogy Explained. It's not exactly an accurate title, since I'm not going to explain ufology. It's daring because my goal is to give you an explanation of both UFOs and ETs. That's right. If anyone has ever approached me with their encounter or experience story and asked me what happened to them or what did it mean, this is my answer. I'm going to give you the straightest answer I can, okay? So let's get going. In case I never mentioned it before, I have never had what I considered to be an encounter with a UFO or an alien intelligence, let alone a ghost or a disembodied entity. I'm just very interested in the subject. And here's one reason why. I had what I called a dentistry experience at age 16, which was the most meaningful, confusing, and profound event I have ever experienced. It had to do with the nature of reality, especially the nature of time. So for years I had grown up having a vivid recurring dream, perhaps as young as age 7. It was of me sitting in a dentist chair. But it wasn't my dentist. In my dreams, I was seated upright in a room with a male dentist. Except my dentist is a woman, and this was not my dentist's office. It was completely unfamiliar. I had this dream so many times I was able to see the whole sequence play out the same time every time that I had this dream. It's a dream where I'm sitting in the chair. The dentist asks me how I'm doing. I nod that I'm okay. He then slaps me in the face, like hard, just to check, like to see if I was anesthetized. That alone made this dream very memorable. But he then sits in the room, he then exits the room and has a brief conversation in the hallway with a female assistant, telling her he is about ready to begin. So years later, at age 16, this event actually took place, every tiny detail of it. It turns out, while I'm sitting in the chair, I'm on nitrous oxide, feeling higher than God at the moment, but still very lucid. I had come to see an oral surgeon, it turns out, not my dentist, to have my wisdom teeth removed. While seated in the chair, I had a déjà vu moment where my recurring dream all came back to me. I instantly knew this was my dream experience, so I thought to myself, hey, he's going to slap me in the face. Well, then he did. I then thought to myself, and now he's going to leave, go out in the hall, and talk to his assistant. He did. Then I thought to myself, oh, he's going to come back in and tell me he's ready to begin. He did. The entire time of him cranking away on my jaw and getting my teeth out, I was jubilant, overwhelmed. I could not escape the ramifications of what this meant. Today, I look back on that experience as communicating something very important to me. But now, today as I'm here with you, this is what it means. The famed UFO researcher Jacques Vallee concluded that the UFO phenomena was trying to tell us something about the nature of time that we don't understand. Now, second, I must discredit any explanation of this event in my life as simply due to being buzzed on nitrous oxide. Any explanation of a phenomena that amounts to explaining away the experience cannot be taken seriously. It is a violation, and in this case, rule violation number 1. Don't do that. Don't explain things away. My explanation of UFOs and ET will not be to explain them away. So let me prove it to you. In my first video presentation, I recommended what I thought to be a complete and comprehensive UFO investigative method called Integral UFOlogy. To determine what cases we need to spend more time on and which we can spend less time on, I proposed 8 areas or categories from which we can derive validity claims of UFO ET reports. I'll just summarize it here briefly. A complete explanation would document what the experiencer experienced subjectively from the interior of that individual. Second would be to document the experiencer's background, their culture, their kind of we space. Third, we need to look at physical objective evidence, if any. And fourth, we'd need to document the objective circumstances surrounding the entire event, especially including corroborating witnesses. But we're not done there. Say you're investigating a case. If I'm to trust you, a field investigator with STAR team credentials, and trust your report, I think it's wise and fair to get a complete picture of the investigation. That means documenting your subjective experience as you heard the experiencer recount what happened to them. That's kind of number 5, which also includes your interviewing skills and how they might contaminate the report. I'd also like to know about your background, your culture, and the we space you inhabit that's in your state association as possible contaminants to your investigation. That's number 6. Number 7, what do you know and what is your background and training in documenting physical evidence? Do you take any measurements? How good are you at gathering and collecting physical evidence? And finally, number 8, what do you know and bring to the table with regard to the circumstances surrounding the event, especially beginning with the time from when you took the initial report to the moment you completed your investigation? To me, this is a complete report that puts all cards on the table. Now, yes, I know this takes a lot of time, much more time than any volunteer investigator would consider worth it. I'd just like to share my approach here in a way that helps you understand how seriously we should take things that will reduce the chances of full and complete investigations being questioned or being explained away because we missed something. Okay, got that out of the way. Now on to Rule 2. Violating Rule 2 to me means providing a non-explanation. So quick story. Our own study group member Rich Webb appeared as a guest on our first season of Spooky Action at a Distance Radio on February 12, 2010. Rich is, or at least was, a member of the International Crop Circle Research Investigation Association. Or was it independent? Not international. I can't remember. Anyway, Rich is a highly regarded member and our resident expert on crop circles. He studied crop circles in great detail and how to distinguish board-stamped ones by human artist hoaxers from the ones that have no good explanation and are truly mysterious. When asked after all his research and study what he had learned about crop circles, Rich said in our interview, quote, "They're anything you want them to be, basically." Now, before you misunderstand and think me critical of Rich, I'm not. It's an axiomatic truth that the more one studies a subject in more and more depth, it turns out the less you know. The more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. It's the aphorism, those who say they know do not know. When you're an expert, it's difficult to be definitive about anything. So that speaks highly of Rich for having made that statement, but it sure does violate my rule number 2. If UFOs and ETs are anything we want them to be, that's just like projecting any interpretation of a Rorschach ink blot test. The stimulus has no design and no meaning. The meaning is what you make of it and tells us about you and your personality, nothing about the object in question. Same goes for the face on Mars. If you were convinced of extraterrestrial sandcastle making based on this photo alone, that is not going to help those of us who would like some reasonable alternatives. Anyway, the point to both of my rules is please don't explain away something, and please don't think a non-explanation is any better. I hope we can agree on that as a starting point. So here's where I'd like to start. Words and their definitions are very important, perhaps most important. So let me define the word explanation. If we can agree to this definition, it will form the basis of everything I'm about to explain in my explanation of UFOs and ETs. An explanation is a set of statements underpinned by text, music, or graphics, constructed to describe a set of facts, which clarifies these three things: the causes of the phenomenon, the context in which the phenomenon occurs, and the consequences of those facts. Causes, context, consequences. Sort of a triple C, except not the drug kind. I hope everybody's good with that. I will take your silence as consent. So my compadre and host of the Spooky Action at a Distance television chat show, Kyle Finley, and I went on a brief speaking circuit sharing these three logical possibilities first coined by Terence McKenna. I've broken down these three explanations here in terms of what each might say as the cause, the context, and the consequences of UFOs and ETs. First is that they're physical but rare. Their cause in this explanation would be a physical cause. The UFO and the ET are physical phenomenon, just rare. The context for this explanation would be mechanical in terms of propulsion and metallurgy in the case of a UFO, or physiological in that an ET, a Bigfoot, a Yeti, a gnome, or a fairy, just like a tall white or a little gray, would be a member of some taxonomic group. The consequence of the rare but physical explanation, I think, would be that we need to go out and find them, figure out their tech, figure out their technology. It means they're out there and very good at hiding. Second is what McKenna calls the Jungian explanation, which is fair because this one is harder to explain, and Jung is always hard to explain. It's some kind of autonomous fragment of psychic energy, in such a way the UFO or ET may not be caused by the consciousness of the human experiencing it, or caused by the collective unconscious of a species. In other words, it's not a mental projection or hallucination or imagined experience. Rather, since the explanation is that this psychic energy is autonomous, the cause is mental, or at least occasioned by the mental experience of the human being making the report. The cause is mental, but at least coincidental. This means that it may be non-human mind, but regardless, the context of this explanation is psychological or sociological, in that at least a human mind is involved. The consequence of this explanation, in my view, is that we need to therefore find ourselves, or look in here as opposed to look out there in order to study them. The third explanation McKenna calls non-physical and autonomous. This explanation blows open the door by rejecting the first two explanations, in that the human mind or collective unconscious of the human species need not be involved, and the cause is not necessarily or fundamentally physical in nature. The source, the cause of the appearance of UFOs and ETs, is non-physical and autonomous in such a way the apprehension of the UFO or ET Could be physical or non-physical, mental or non-mental, both or neither. Of course, this makes the context equally confusing. What is a non-physical UFO? What is a non-mental UFO? What we find in this explanation, however, is that it is most consistent with witnesses and experiencer reports. It's unclear in such a way the UFO or ET was there but not there, communicating whether I was there or not. The consequence of this explanation comes close to being a non-explanation, but I don't think it is. The consequence of this explanation is that you need to see for yourself. You must have an experience in order to understand when witnesses make emphatic statements like, "I know it's impossible, but I know what I saw." So I'd like to help those people. If you're connected to social media group dedicated to UFOs, or if you are a member of a group of UFO investigators, very often what you find is that people come to you with their experience, their story. They recount their experience and tell you their story and are happy to answer questions about it. But they do so in order to ask the question, what happened to me? Why did this happen to me? They're asking for an explanation because so often experiences like this are impossible to understand. So let me share with you my first explanation of ETs. Now, note, when I say ET, I don't simply mean extraterrestrial because that already assumes it's a species from beyond the Earth. When I say ET, I mean it as broad a term that encompasses what experiencers report when they use descriptive words like entities, non-human intelligence, aliens, star people, or simply visitors. Because that's what they do. They visit. They impact our life in a profound way, and then they leave you to pick up the pieces. The explanation I gave in my talk called Alien Ontology is this. Like a virus, ETs are situated between the living and non-living. I considered them to be a nexus of unassimilated abstract thought forms of information. ETs are a byproduct of self-sustaining confusion. The cause of ETs I call processes of confusing information. The cause is what happens when information is shared, in particular information that is confusing. And instead of declaring the cause physical, non-physical, mental, or non-mental, I use the word process. The cause of the encounter is a process because that's what happens when it comes to information. Information is processed. The context of this explanation is that information must be processed. The information being shared is shared because it needs to be understood. It needs to be assimilated. The insistence of this information and its need to be assimilated is obvious to experiencers. So the consequence of this explanation, or what we should do about it, is we need to process this information. We need to assimilate it. We need to understand the language, the word, the logos, the meaning. You can think of the insistence of encounters with ET to be rather like the most frightening scene in the movie Fatal Attraction. It's not when Glenn Close boils the bunny rabbit. That's not the most frightening scene in the film. It's when she gives a good hard look to Michael Douglas's character and says, "I'm not going to be ignored, Dan." That seems to be it with ETs. They are not going to be ignored. So now on to UFOs. I shared a rather elaborate explanation for UFO craft and their habits of winking out and causing missing time in my talk called Super UFOlogy, published in the year 2017. I had to dig deep here to comprehend what modern physics says about the quantum world versus the Newtonian world and how to reconcile the two. Matter, like physical matter, physicists tell us, is mostly made up of empty space. And when you try to nail down what a subatomic particle is, it turns out the basis of matter is either a wave or a particle. And here's the most important part, depending on how you measure it. It's called the observer effect in physics. If you think UFOs and ETs are strange, get a load of what physicists consider to be ordinary reality when they describe terms like the uncertainty principle, superposition, entanglement, or the holographic nature of reality. So after taking all this into consideration, I decided my explanation of UFOs is that they were complex systems of mind that dissipate heat energy through movement across space and time. I founded this explanation based on a description of ordinary reality from the standard model in physics and how particles get their mass in the Higgs field. I applied that understanding to Roger Penrose's twistor theory, where causal sequences do not fluctuate. Yes, that's right, you heard me right. Causal sequences don't fluctuate or change that then impact space and time. What fluctuates from a deeper reality is space and time. Space and time fluctuate. This means the location and timing of events fluctuate. Now, tying this together with the work of Jeremy England, Dan Siegel, and Daniel Wolpert, this explanation gives us the cause of UFOs as an interaction of complex mental systems capable of manifesting craft. The interaction of these complex systems then bump into human minds that act as antennae. The context of this interaction is the sharing of meaning and information. This is much like the context of my explanation of ETs. The consequence of this explanation of UFOs is the same. Although the cause is different, the consequence is the same. UFO contact must be assimilated, processed as information, and we need to understand the language, the word, the logos, the meaning of this information. Now, I know all this begs the question, what is the information being shared with us? What does it mean? What are they trying to say? Well, don't worry, I'll get there. I just need to lay a little more groundwork before I conclude with some possible answers to those questions. First, I need to take a trip into the world of Donald Hoffman. You can look up some of his TED Talks on YouTube if you want. I'll just try to summarize his position, which he calls conscious realism. When Donald Hoffman looks at an apple, he has discovered he's not looking at an actual apple. He says we don't see things as they actually are. The reason is pretty obvious. We are creatures that have developed sensory apparatus not to improve accuracy, but for only two purposes. We are evolved for fitness. Our purpose is to avoid dying and to live long enough to procreate. That's it. So when you think of the electromagnetic spectrum as, say the length of the Missouri River from low-frequency radio waves and microwaves all the way to high-frequency X-rays and gamma rays, we don't see them. The spectrum of light we use in vision is a tiny fraction, maybe an inch or two long compared to the length of the Missouri River. We see what we need to see, and we only need to see things according to whether our vision will assist us in not dying and living long enough to have children, just like any other organism. It's the same way when you think of sound, because when there is a range of sound that we can't hear. We also know dogs can't smell things we can't. Dogs can smell things we can't. The reason is evolution is all about sacrificing one thing for another. We developed a bigger brain in order to survive, whereas a dog needs to detect smells better. Think about this from Monty Python skit called The Funniest Joke. In this bit on Python, we learn a man wrote a joke so funny that it was lethal. Anyone who read it died of laughing. So this photo of Neville Chamberlain holding a copy of the joke in his hand explains the military purpose of this joke prior to World War II. So what's the joke? It goes like this. My dog has no nose. So how does it smell? Awful. See? The joke is funny, but I guarantee if you read it to your dog, they won't get it. Okay, maybe it was that funny. I should not try humor in these things. Sorry about that. I'm experimenting with comedy now, I guess. So conscious realism doesn't say you create your own reality. It would be more accurate to say reality consists of conscious agents and their experiences. That position is called non-physicalist monism. Monism basically means one, or more precisely, there are no separate things. But if you're not interested in philosophical terminology, think of it this way. Your state, your fitness, how you evolved to this point, determines what is perceived. You don't see actual things out there because reality consists of conscious agents and their experiences. Instead of an objective reality, we only perceive tools and obstacles. We see cars as things that take us places. We see food as things we can possibly eat. A hammer is that thing that can hit things. Now take a look at the top picture here of dinnerware paper products. Look closely. Do you see any pieces of this dinnerware as upside down, or are they all right side up? If I were to tell you one of them is right side up, can you figure out which one it is? And all the others are facing down. Does that make a difference? If I were to tell you all of them are face down except for one that is right side up, what about that? So this optical illusion isn't an illusion really. It's an illustration of how you can see things differently. It's kind of like the observer effect in physics. My guess is if you're a bit hungry, you might see these plates, ready to put food in. For me, all I have to imagine is how many little smokies I can put on one of those things, like I'm at a family reunion or something. But if you like doing crafts, say you're a crafty person, you might more likely see them as facing down. Something you can stack on or make a face out of, or a Halloween costume or something like that. The point is that we are always in some state of being at any moment, and the state we are in determines our perception. It can get ambiguous when you look at something that has no obvious use as a tool, like when the bottom picture is simply 8 black circles with white lines. There are no white lines between the circles, but you see them really, can't you? The last one might be too small if you're viewing this on a small screen, but put your finger between the 2 blocks. You can easily see how they're the same color, right? And take your finger away and they look obviously different. All this is to say that with regard to my explanation of UFOs and ETs, the information you process from an encounter with a nexus of unassimilated thought forms, or a complex system of mind dissipating heat through movement in space and time, that your state will determine how you perceive the meaning, the language being communicated. The UFO or ET will be seen as either a tool or an obstacle. So in order to understand the meaning or decipher the code, it's helpful to know that you can change your state. This is the work of Tony Robbins I'd like to mention briefly. Tony helps people realize that when you sit up straight with your shoulders back, the world and the people around you change and respond differently to you. It's as simple as when you're walking somewhere like a hospital and you don't want to be bothered or questioned where you're going, just look like you know exactly where you're going, even if you don't. people will not likely bother you. Or you can see the value of coming up with personal affirmations to the point you can change obstacles that are in your way into tools. You can see the world as opportunities as opposed to something that provokes fear and anxiety. So I'm told by my financial advisor not to panic when I see the stock market crash. Think of it as the stock market being on sale, as an opportunity, something to buy at a low price. The meaning of events and experiences in your life can change when you simply change your state. Okay, a couple more things before I take you to the grand finale. If you think about your state of being, it's not hard to imagine it as Jordan Peterson does. You inhabit a world full of suffering Peterson calls the unbearable present. Life is difficult. Life is brutal. Just when we think we have a good plan, life comes along to knock us down. We have to pull ourselves together when the world gets turned upside down. So we inhabit this unpredictable, chaotic world that can become unbearable, while at the same time we're always imagining this ideal future. We are always making plans to make the world a better place. Well, at least I hope you are. As Peterson would say, do you have anything better to do? That is, better to do than making the world a better place. We feel safe and secure when things are nice and orderly. Like when we get into a routine and know where we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be doing and why. What we realize, though, is that we need to sacrifice things that bring us immediate pleasure in order to fulfill our aim at an imagined future that can somehow justify the suffering we experience in the unbearable present. This is what brings meaning to our lives. In fact, we have every reason to believe we have evolved and adapted as an organism to do just that. The left hemisphere of our brain gets activated when we encounter things that are familiar, orderly, logical, where things make sense. The right hemisphere of our brain gets activated in our chaotic imagination with stories, shapes, music, patterns that are unknown or not well understood. This combination is what is illustrated in the yin-yang symbol. We live in a world of order and chaos, constantly in a process of bringing order to chaos. We do that by sacrifice. So Terence McKenna said UFOs were, quote, the soul become object, end quote. And ET experiences are an encounter with, quote, an organism made of information that becomes dirigible, end quote. This is very close to my explanation, except that Terence McKenna's work really focused on the use of tryptamine hallucinogens, said to loosen this tight grip we seem to have on reality as it appears. J.V. Wallach said in researching these compounds as a pharmacist, at least I think he's a pharmacist, waking reality can be thought of as a tightly regulated psychedelic experience. That means what you're experiencing right now is a tightly regulated psychedelic experience. Some plant molecules cause that tight experience to loosen. So I do think in tangents, trying to connect different ideas in my explanation. So this reminded me of one of Chevy Chase's bits on Weekend Update from Saturday Night Live. He reads the bit, "A reminder to those of our viewers who missed our story last week on the influx of so-called killer dope in urban areas around the country. Weekend Update has been analyzing the samples of marijuana sent to us anonymously all week. We are pleased to report that so far the only significant finding has been that if you force a baby squirrel to smoke 700 cannabis joints a day, he will become disoriented, seem to take the laws of self-preservation less seriously, tending to play with his nuts rather than store them." Okay, that might be my last attempt at humor. So we're nearing my grand finale. If you were to post something on our UNO MUFON UFO Society Facebook page, or ask me personally what about your encounter with a UFO or ET, say you ask me the question, "So what happened to me, Steve?" This will be my explanation. I will say that you encountered an entangled transmission of heat dissipating energy in the form of meaning that rested, or actually arrested, you on the cusp of order and chaos. I will say what caused it is a species-specific perceptual experience among conscious agents with either a sole object, if it was a UFO, or if it was an ET you encountered, an organism made of information that became dirigible. So that is, capable of being steered, guided, or directed. The context in which this event took place was an adaptation to a shared reality of a process of experience where your state acted as an antenna that picked up on unfamiliar or confusing perceptions. If you were to ask me what it means or what you should do about it, I will say any interpretation of seemingly impossible things like this implies a need for you to turn this chaos into order. You should not ask what was it, you should focus on what it meant for you in your life. You need to assimilate this experience in a way that you can make the world a better place because of it. As you look for that meaning of your experience, I'd like to reassure you from the work of probably the single best scientist who studied UFOs, Jacques Vallee. I addressed Vallee's interdimensional hypothesis in my talk called Super UFOlogy. Now, what I didn't mention in that talk was how Vallee looked at the UFO phenomenon as sort of a cultural thermostat. The phenomenon was so strange, so bizarre, so telling us that we don't understand the nature of time, that he could not help to think that the purpose of the UFO phenomenon was confounding. Its purpose was to be confounding. It's as if everything about the phenomenon was to break the force of whatever dominant ideas that presume to tell us we know how the world works, in order to loosen that force. That seemed to be the meaning. That seemed to be the purpose for Vallee, to break all our assumptions. The best way to understand this is for me to repeat Dennis Miller on the subject of those crazy kids with their crazy ideas when he said, "It remains the single most important function of a generation to irk the living blank out of the generation immediately preceding it. This is the purpose of UFOs and ETs, apparently. As I'm about to share with you some possible meanings of the UFO ET phenomenon, I'd like you to consider those last few slides as tips. So here's one more. The philosopher David Hume came up with the idea that is called Hume's distinction now. Hume described science as the study of what is, as compared to philosophy and religion that studies what should be or what ought to be. Science can speak to us on what is, but any scientific discovery does not carry with it what it means or what we ought to do with it. Take the splitting of the atom as an example. Science can tell us that we can blow up the world, but it doesn't tell us whether we should. Most of us think that what we should do or what something means is nested within reality or what is. The challenge here is for us to move toward the opposite way of thinking. Imagine how reality, or what it could actually be nested within, what should be or what ought to be or what something means. This is the last tip I'd like to leave you with before this grand finale. So here it is, what you've all been waiting for. This is what the UFO ET phenomenon could mean. As you look at the title of this slide, let me start by defining concrescence, which is the coalescence or growing together of parts originally separate. An apocalyptic concrescence would be what Terence McKenna deemed the overarching function of UFO ET experiences when he called it the, quote, overmind deconditioning humanity in a time of crisis, end quote. When things seem to be going horribly wrong, we end up with prophecies and signs, deeper meanings that help us through to discover order out of chaos. Every generation has such a crisis, but some examples could include Athens, Greece rising, or the axial age of religious thought with the arrival of Lao Tzu, the Buddha, Christ in the midst of Roman Empire. Then the earth got really cold for about a century until the birth of science and the Age of Enlightenment. The threat of thermonuclear war, the Holocaust, and the bloody history of communism are more recent crises that seem to coincide with the modern UFO phenomenon. What I'm offering here are some words and phrases to give you an idea of the language, some different possible meanings that might be transmitted in our time of crisis. Number 1, isn't that interesting? Yes, we're not alone. There are other spacefaring nations, and it basically looks like we're getting wrapped up and invited into a twisted Star Wars epic saga of good versus evil. So what? Number 2, think of Carl Sagan's film Contact, where beings from the planet Vega faxed down instructions on how to build a machine that could take us to them. Perhaps the meaning being transmitted is material for energy and invention. Number 3, that's more of a straightforward deconstruction of reality as we think we know it. An archaic revival of sorts to undermine our common belief that we are foremost living in a world made of matter. This one is a suggestion that we go back to the days of alchemy. Number 4 is a compelling one. It's the idea that life on Earth was seeded by comets, known as panspermia, but in this case, perhaps the human form of bilateral symmetry was seeded in our DNA by a generation of beings many, many years ago. You'd have to look at the Star Trek Next Generation episode called The Chase, where Picard learned humans, Klingons, Cardassians, and Romulans all had a common ancestry, with the secret being hidden in a star map in our DNA. Number 5. If you think about your conscious decisions for even a moment, you quickly learn most of your decisions you make bubble up from unconscious motivations. So number 5 refers to the UFO ET phenomenon as a totality signal moving into our conscious experience on the border between revealing the unconscious to conscious awareness. Number 6, I suppose we can't rule out the idea of time travel, so consider the idea that we do blow ourselves up or we wipe out humanity before we can get off this planet. Perhaps the UFO ET phenomenon is some kind of techno-experiment from our own future. It's us coming back to warn us and correct things. Perhaps our ancestors realized that the key screw-up occurred sometime, about in the mid-20th century, and they've come to correct it. Okay, number 7 gets pretty mystical, so I'll start with a quotation from Ken Wilber, who said, "Poor man, up from the beasts and not yet a god, he was that unhappy mixture. He was mortal, and he knew it." Should we really be wondering about whether the boundary between living and death is unreal? Is there an ecology of souls that has come to teach us of the erasure of that boundary? Death does not truly exist. Number 8 is something similar and is consistent with many religious traditions, as well as that channeled writing of Edgar Cayce or the raw material that I addressed in my last talk. called Striking UFOlogy. If our identity is a nexus of thought forms that one might call a soul, is it possible that life is but the stabilizing and perfecting of this identity in what is called an after-death vehicle? Okay, number 9 is really hard to describe again, since anything Carl Jung writes is hard to summarize. But in his treatment on the subject of flying saucers as modern myth of things seen in the sky, Jung describes how prophetic figures, spiritual leaders, and mystical insights occur when part of the collective unconscious is split from itself. Call it a deep psychic crisis that repeats itself time and again. Jung describes these figures, leaders, and insights as a savior, or saving grace he calls a uniting symbol, like the cross or crucifix. A true spiritual hero causes a revival under the same symbol of sacrifice in order to unite humanity. Now, I'm not very clear on how flying saucers could be a uniting symbol, but I can't ignore the obvious unifying force that would come where the message, "We are not alone in the universe," become undeniable and irrefutable. So finally, I have to pay homage to Terence McKenna once again, since I've already borrowed some of his concepts in this list. Number 10 has one word on it: hypercarbylation. Imagine that you were to go along with my explanation of UFOs and ETs, and that matter itself in the standard model of physics consists of vibrations and oscillations. Now, imagine what is reported about tryptamine hallucinogenic molecules, in that administering them in the proper dosage replicates, or at least approximates, encounters with UFOs and alien intelligences. Now finally, recall that chanting of music or tonal frequencies induces a powerful sense of meaning that is difficult to put into words. This is the experiment that Terence's brother Dennis underwent that caused him to go bananas for about 3 weeks. In that experiment, 3 substances were administered to Dennis according to their resonance properties, which caused an audible series of tones that Dennis could hear and reproduce. So Dennis takes some chemicals, and they result in him hearing a tone and tonal frequencies. The question under investigation was whether you can use the sound of your voice to intercalate drug molecules into DNA rungs in the human body. And if so, what happens? So, if you're getting this, take some hallucinogens, hear the tones, and then start resonating with those tones with your voice. See what happens. Well, I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to recommend it. If I'm going to uncover the mystery of my own spirit, I prefer growth and development in a way I can handle at my own pace. Hypercarbylation would seem to be a plausible shortcut to full-on mind-blowing to the deeper realities in our imagination. I have earthly responsibilities to myself and my family, which involve sacrifices, so I must imagine Dennis McKenna had to wake up the next day and decide what to do with the information and meaning that he encountered. Well, that is the list of possible meanings for you to consider. I hope you use them wisely to make the world a better place. I thank you all again, the few of you who apparently are interested in ideas like this. To me and our study group of folks in Nebraska interested in the subject, it is not about the destination, it's about the journey. If you tell me about an experience you had or ask me what it means, I'll probably just refer you back to this presentation and my other presentations on this YouTube channel. Otherwise, please feel free to peruse all of our free content online at omahaufostudygroup.com, or watch my other videos on the Omaha UFO Study Group YouTube channel. Check out our Facebook page by searching the UNO MUFON UFO Society, the only MUFON-affiliated university-based club in the world. Spend some time watching our own Kyle Finley's contribution to the field on his Spooky Action at a Distance television channel on YouTube. And finally, to keep us all grounded, check our member David Paris's his nuts and bolts efforts to discover space propulsion systems. He has a very terrestrial and mechanical approach with now Model 16 of a variable electromagnetic drive, or VEM drive, that is designed and does warp the fabric of space, hence the name Space Warp Dynamics LLC.com. Or follow the latest research on this entirely self-funded project by following the Space Warp Dynamics page on Facebook. Thank you for your time and attention. Once again,